Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Echo. Tonight we journey through some of the most chilling true crime cases in recent memory. I'm your host, and for the next 1 hour, we'll explore 7 disturbing stories that reveal the darkest corners of human behavior. As you listen to the gentle rain outside your window, we'll carefully examine these cases together. Each story is tragic, each victim deserves to be remembered, and each case teaches us something about the world we live in. Before we begin our first story, I want to ask you, what makes someone capable of such violence against another human being? Is it something that builds over time, or does it happen in an instant of rage? Think about that as we begin our first disturbing tale. Story 1. Our first story takes us to Minnesota, where what started as a marriage ends in an unimaginable act of violence. In Stillwater, Minnesota, a seemingly normal relationship would eventually spiral into tragedy. Stephen Grunow, 40, and his wife Tammy, 41, had been married, but their relationship was anything but peaceful. The couple had a troubled history, with hints of jealousy that would ultimately lead to a horrific outcome. What drives someone to become consumed with jealousy? Have you ever felt that emotion begin to take control of your thoughts? For Stephen Grunow, jealousy became an obsession. On May 9, 2022, something terrible happened in the Grunow home. What began as an argument escalated into violence. According to court documents, Stephen's jealousy erupted that evening. In a moment of rage, he drowned his wife in their bathroom toilet. Imagine the terror of those final moments. What goes through someone's mind as they take another person's life in such a brutal manner? Stephen later told investigators that he held her head in the toilet until she stopped moving. Think about the strength of that rage, to continue holding someone underwater until they stop struggling. What darkness must exist in someone's heart to commit such an act? After committing this horrific crime, Stephen didn't immediately call for help. Instead, he went to bed, leaving Tammy's body on the bathroom floor. It wasn't until the following morning that emergency services were called. When police arrived, they found Tammy unresponsive. Despite attempts to revive her, she was pronounced dead. The medical examiner would later confirm what had happened: Tammy had been drowned. How does someone sleep after taking a life? What thoughts must have gone through Stephen's mind as he awoke the next morning to the reality of what he had done? In February 2023, Stephen Grunow entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. The court would hear about his admission of guilt, his explanation that he had acted in a jealous rage. In May 2023, exactly 1 year after Tammy's death, Stephen Grunow was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As he was led away in handcuffs, one question remained: was this justice for Tammy? Family members shared their grief at the sentencing. Tammy's sister expressed that no amount of time will bring Tammy back, while her brother said they were relieved that he will never be able to hurt anyone else. Can a life sentence ever truly bring closure to the family of a murder victim? What would you say to Tammy's family if you could speak with them? Our next story takes us to Michigan, where a disturbing discovery would reveal secrets hidden behind closed doors for years. As we transition, I want you to consider, how well do we really know our neighbors? The people living just next door might be harboring the darkest of secrets. Story 2. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, residents of a quiet neighborhood were about to discover that a suspected serial killer had been living among them. Chad Huth, a 53-year-old man, had managed to hide his disturbing activities from those around him for years. The case began to unfold when authorities started investigating the disappearance of multiple women in the area. Have you ever noticed someone go missing from your community? How do people simply vanish without a trace? What investigators would find inside Chad Huth's home would answer those questions in the most horrifying way possible. When police entered Huth's residence on March 18, 2024, they weren't prepared for what they would discover. According to the prosecutor's office, officers found human bones stored in Huth's bedroom. Think about that for a moment. Human remains, kept as trophies or souvenirs. What kind of person collects such macabre items? What satisfaction could someone possibly gain from such behavior? Investigators would later determine that the remains belonged to multiple women who had disappeared from the area over several years. Some had been reported missing by concerned families. Others had simply vanished, with no one to report their absence. The women who fell victim to Huth shared certain characteristics. According to court documents, they were vulnerable individuals, some involved in high-risk lifestyles, others struggling with addiction or homelessness. They were people who might not be immediately missed. What does it say about our society that some people can disappear without causing immediate alarm? Why are certain victims more likely to receive attention than others? Authorities would eventually identify several of the victims, reconnecting them with families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. For some families, the answers were worse than the uncertainty they had lived with. As investigators pieced together the evidence, a disturbing pattern emerged. Huth would allegedly target vulnerable women, gain their trust, and lure them to his home. What happened next remains a subject of ongoing investigation, but the results were always tragic. The prosecutor's office labeled Huth a suspected serial killer, stating that evidence suggested he had been operating for years. They noted that he had developed a methodology, a pattern of behavior that allowed him to continue his activities without detection. How does someone hide such disturbing behavior from friends, neighbors, and co-workers? What signs might have been missed by those around him? Chad Huth was charged with multiple counts of murder. As his case moves through the legal system, investigators continue to work to identify all of his victims and determine the full extent of his crimes. During his initial court appearance, Huth maintained his innocence despite the evidence presented. The judge ordered him held without bail, citing the serious nature of the charges and the risk to public safety. If convicted, Huth faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the families of his victims, no punishment can undo the harm he has caused. I ask you, how do communities recover from discovering such evil in their midst? What changes might come from this horrific revelation? Before we continue to our next story, I want to ask you, have you ever wondered what might be hidden behind your neighbor's walls? As we explore our next case, we'll see how one New York couple's disappearance led to a grisly discovery across multiple locations. Story 3. In Queens, New York, the disappearance of a couple would eventually lead investigators to a horrifying discovery. Carla Stevens, 65, and her husband Alvin Stevens, 68, were reported missing in early 2024 after family members became concerned when they couldn't reach them. The couple had been married for over 40 years and were described by neighbors as quiet and private. They lived in a modest home in a residential neighborhood, keeping mostly to themselves. What circumstances would lead to the disappearance of two people who had built their lives together for decades? What happened inside that home that would end in tragedy? When police first entered the Stevens home, they found no obvious signs of the couple. Their car was still in the driveway. Their belongings appeared undisturbed. But something didn't feel right to the investigators. As they continued their search, small details began to suggest something terrible had happened. A more thorough examination of the house revealed trace evidence that would lead detectives down a disturbing path. Have you ever had that feeling that something isn't quite right? That instinct that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The detectives working this case had that feeling, and they were right to trust it. The investigation took a horrifying turn when human remains were discovered at a property in the Bronx. Not all of the remains, just some. Further investigation led to another discovery in a wooded area in Long Island. And then a third location in Manhattan. The victims had been dismembered, their remains scattered across 3 different locations in the greater New York area. Medical examiners would later confirm through DNA testing that the remains belonged to Carla and Alvin Stevens. Who would commit such a calculated act? What kind of planning and cold determination would it take to dispose of human remains in this manner? As investigators pieced together evidence from the 3 scenes, they identified a suspect, Leonard Mitchell, 42, a relative of the Stevens couple. According to court documents, Mitchell had a history of financial problems and had recently asked the couple for money. Investigators believe that when they refused, an argument ensued that ended in violence. Rather than seeking help or turning himself in, Mitchell allegedly took extraordinary steps to conceal his crime. Think about the progression here, from an argument over money to the calculated disposal of human remains across multiple locations. What happens in someone's mind to allow such an escalation? Mitchell was arrested and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence. During his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty to all charges. Prosecutors described the case as particularly disturbing due to the methodical way the bodies had been treated after death. They argued that the level of planning indicated premeditation rather than a crime of passion. The defense countered that the evidence was circumstantial and that no witnesses had come forward who could place Mitchell at any of the 3 locations where remains were found. As the case proceeds through the court system, the families of Carla and Alvin Stevens wait for justice. But can any verdict truly provide closure after such a horrific crime? I'll leave you with this question: how well do we really know our family members? What hidden tensions might exist beneath the surface of family relationships? Our next story takes us to California, where a missing person case would lead to one of the most disturbing discoveries in recent memory. Listen closely, the details of this next case reveal how quickly a relationship can turn deadly. Story 4. In Stockton, California, 37-year-old Amanda Taylor was reported missing by her colleagues when she failed to show up for work 3 days in a row. Known for her reliability and dedication, her absence immediately raised concerns. Amanda's friends described her as vibrant and friendly, someone who loved her job as a dental hygienist and had recently moved in with her boyfriend, 40-year-old Daniel Salcedo. The couple had been dating for approximately 8 months. What would make a responsible person like Amanda suddenly vanish without contacting anyone? Had something happened to her, or had she chosen to disappear? When police first visited the apartment Amanda shared with Daniel, they found him cooperative but evasive about certain details. He claimed that Amanda had left after an argument, taking some personal belongings with her. However, Amanda's car was still parked outside. Her cell phone had not been used since the day before she was reported missing. Her bank accounts showed no activity. What would you think if your loved one disappeared under these circumstances? What questions would you want investigators to ask? As detectives continued their investigation, they noticed inconsistencies in Daniel's story. Security footage from the apartment complex showed Amanda entering the building on the evening she was last seen, but there was no footage of her leaving. Friends revealed that Amanda had recently expressed concerns about Daniel's possessive behavior. Text messages recovered from her phone showed she had been considering ending the relationship. What warning signs might have been present in this relationship? How often do we ignore red flags when we care for someone? Based on the accumulating evidence, investigators obtained a search warrant for the apartment. What they discovered would shock even experienced detectives. In the bathroom and kitchen, forensic teams found traces of blood that had been carefully cleaned up. Testing would later confirm it was Amanda's blood. But Amanda herself was nowhere to be found. When questioned about the blood evidence, Daniel's story began to change. He claimed Amanda had cut herself accidentally before leaving. Then he suggested she might have harmed herself intentionally. As pressure mounted, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. And then, investigators made a breakthrough in the case. Cell phone records showed that Daniel had visited a storage facility outside of town multiple times in the days after Amanda's disappearance. When police obtained a warrant to search the unit registered in his name, they made a horrifying discovery. Inside, they found several plastic containers. Within those containers were the dismembered remains of Amanda Taylor. The medical examiner would later determine that Amanda had been strangled to death before her body was dismembered. The crime appeared to have been committed in the apartment, with the remains then transported to the storage unit. Can you imagine the level of detachment required to treat another human being this way? What happens to someone's humanity that allows them to commit such an act? Daniel Salcedo was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation, arguing that Daniel had purchased the plastic containers and cleaning supplies days before Amanda's death. The defense attempted to argue that Daniel had acted in self-defense during an argument that escalated to violence. However, the physical evidence contradicted this claim. After a 3-week trial, the jury found Daniel Salcedo guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her victim impact statement, Amanda's mother addressed Daniel directly, "You didn't just take my daughter's life. You tried to erase her existence. But she will always be remembered for the beautiful person she was, not for how she died." Is there any sentence severe enough for someone who not only takes a life but treats the victim with such disregard? What does justice look like in a case like this? As we move to our 5th story, I want you to consider how long secrets can remain hidden. Our next case involves a man who evaded capture for over 2 decades before finally facing justice. Story 5. For 24 years, 72-year-old Robert Parmenter lived a quiet life under an assumed identity. His neighbors in the small Oregon town where he settled knew him as a friendly retiree who kept to himself but was always willing to help with community projects. What these neighbors didn't know was that Parmenter was one of the most wanted fugitives in the country, a suspected serial rapist who had terrorized women across multiple states in the late 1990s. How does someone hide in plain sight for more than 2 decades? What skills does it take to create and maintain a false identity for so long? Between 1998 and 2000, a series of sexual assaults occurred in California, Oregon, and Washington. The attacks followed a pattern. Women living alone were targeted, usually at night. The perpetrator would break into their homes, threaten them with a weapon, and sexually assault them. Police connected at least 7 attacks to the same perpetrator based on DNA evidence. But despite extensive investigation, they couldn't identify the man responsible. The case eventually went cold, though the DNA profile remained in law enforcement databases. The victims of these attacks had their lives forever altered. Many reported ongoing trauma, difficulty trusting others, and fear of being alone. One victim moved across the country. Another installed extensive security systems in her home. Have you ever considered how a traumatic event can reshape someone's entire life? How one night of violence can echo through decades? In early 2024, advances in forensic genealogy, the same technology that identified the Golden State Killer, provided investigators with new leads in the case. By comparing the perpetrator's DNA to samples in public databases, they were able to identify potential relatives. Working with these distant genetic connections, investigators constructed a family tree that eventually led them to Robert Parmenter, or rather, to the man he had been before assuming a new identity. Further investigation revealed that Parmenter had disappeared around the time the sexual assault stopped. He had abandoned his previous life, including a wife and children, and moved across the country. What would drive someone to completely abandon their identity? Was it just to escape justice, or was there something more complex at work? When police finally tracked Parmenter to his Oregon home, they found a man who had aged considerably but was still recognizable from old photographs. According to reports, he seemed resigned when officers arrived at his door. "I always knew this day would come," he allegedly told the arresting officers. "I just thought I'd be dead before it did." A DNA sample confirmed what investigators already suspected: Parmenter was the man they had been seeking for over 2 decades. Charged with multiple counts of rape, kidnapping, and burglary, Parmenter now faces the possibility of spending what remains of his life in prison. Due to the serious nature of his crimes, he was denied bail. Some of his victims, now in their 50s and 60s, expressed relief at his capture. One woman, who had been attacked in her Seattle apartment in 1999, told reporters, "For 24 years, I've looked over my shoulder. Now I can finally stop." The prosecutor handling the case noted that while the statute of limitations had expired for some potential charges, the most serious offenses had no time limit. "Justice may be delayed," she said, "but it will not be denied." What does justice look like after such a long time? Can any punishment truly address the harm caused to the victims who have lived with the trauma for decades? As we prepare for our sixth story, I want to ask you to consider the impact of unsolved crimes. Not just on the victims' families, but on entire communities. Our next case remains one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in American history. Story 6. In Ina, Illinois, the Dardeen family was living what many would consider the American dream. Russell Dardeen, 29, worked at a local water treatment plant. His wife Ruby, 30, was a nurse at a nursing home. Their son Peter was just 3 years old, and Ruby was 7 months pregnant with their second child, a girl they planned to name Casey. By all accounts, they were a happy family. Russell coached a local youth baseball team. Ruby was active in their church. They had recently moved into a new mobile home and were preparing for the arrival of their daughter. What would drive someone to target such a seemingly perfect family? What darkness would descend upon this small community? On November 18, 1987, Russell failed to show up for work. This was highly unusual for him, as colleagues described him as exceptionally reliable. Concerned, his supervisor contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department and requested a welfare check. When Deputy Neil Hicks arrived at the Dardeen home, he found the front door unlocked. Inside, he discovered a scene so horrific that it would haunt him for the rest of his career. In the bedroom lay the bodies of Ruby, Peter, and a newborn infant girl. Ruby had gone into labor during the attack. All three had been brutally beaten to death with a baseball bat that was later found at the scene. The baby, who had never had a chance to take her first breath outside the womb, was posthumously named Casey as her parents had intended. But Russell was nowhere to be found. Initially, investigators considered the possibility that Russell might have been responsible for the murders of his family before fleeing. However, this theory was quickly dismissed when Russell's body was discovered the following day. His car had been abandoned in a wheat field approximately a mile from the family home. Russell had been shot once in the head before his body was placed in the trunk of his own car. The level of violence inflicted on this family shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. What could possibly motivate such a brutal attack on an innocent family? As investigators began to piece together the events leading up to the murders, they discovered several unusual details. There were no signs of forced entry to the home, suggesting the Dardeens may have known their killer or killers. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, ruling out robbery as a motive. The careful placement of Russell's body away from the crime scene indicated planning and deliberation rather than a random act of violence. Neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar car in the area on the night of the murders, but no one could provide a detailed description. Other potential leads emerged. A traveling carnival had recently been in the area, and there were rumors of drug activity in nearby communities. But despite extensive investigation, no suspects were identified. No arrests were made. The case gradually went cold. In 2000, a convicted serial killer named Tommy Lynn Sells claimed responsibility for the Dardeen murders during a jailhouse interview. Sells, who was on death row for the murder of a 13-year-old girl, confessed to numerous killings across the country. According to Sells, he had been passing through Illinois when he spotted Ruby Dardeen hanging laundry outside her home. He claimed he approached the house, forced his way in, and committed the murders. However, investigators found inconsistencies in Sells' account. Details he provided did not match the evidence at the crime scene. Furthermore, Sells had a history of falsely confessing to high-profile murders in an apparent attempt to delay his own execution. Sells was executed in Texas in 2014, taking any knowledge he might have had about the Dardeen case to his grave. More than 3 decades later, the Dardeen family murders remain unsolved. The case has been revisited multiple times by different investigators, but no conclusive evidence has emerged. The brutality of the crimes has left a lasting impact on the community of Ina. Many residents who lived there at the time have since moved away, unable to shake the fear that settled over the town after the murders. For the extended Dardeen family, the lack of closure continues to compound their grief. Russell's mother, Joanne Dardeen, spent years advocating for justice for her son and his family. She passed away in 2018, never knowing who had taken her loved ones. Why do some cases remain unsolved despite intensive investigation? What happens to a community when such a violent crime goes unpunished? Our final story takes us to Oregon, where a man's violent past would eventually catch up with him. As we explore this case, consider how patterns of behavior can escalate over time if left unchecked. Story 7. In Portland, Oregon, the disappearances of 3 women over a span of 5 years initially appeared unconnected. Charity Wilson, 38, vanished in 2018. Margaret Hoffman, 42, disappeared in 2020. And Jennifer Cruz, 35, was reported missing in 2023. The women came from different backgrounds and lived in different areas of the city. At first glance, there was little to suggest their cases were related. But as investigators would eventually discover, all 3 women shared one fatal connection: Jessie Hartman. How often do we fail to see patterns until it's too late? What connections might exist between seemingly unrelated events? Charity Wilson was last seen leaving her apartment to meet a friend for coffee. When she never arrived, her friend reported her missing. Police found her car in a shopping center parking lot, but Charity herself had vanished. 2 years later, Margaret Hoffman disappeared after finishing her shift at a local hospital. Security footage showed her walking to her car, but she never made it home. Her purse was found in a dumpster 3 blocks from the hospital. And then in 2023, Jennifer Cruz told her roommate she was going on a date with someone she had met online. She didn't return that night, and her dating profile was deleted the following day. In each case, initial investigations yielded few leads. The women seemed to have simply vanished without a trace. The breakthrough came when a detective reviewing cold cases noticed similarities in the disappearances. All 3 women had been active on dating sites shortly before they vanished. And when investigators obtained records from these sites, they found that all 3 had communicated with profiles that, while using different names, appeared to be linked to the same person. Digital forensics revealed that these different dating profiles had been accessed from the same devices. And those devices belonged to Jessie Hartman, a 45-year-old Portland resident with a history of domestic violence complaints. What digital footprints do we leave behind without realizing it? How has technology changed the way crimes are investigated? Armed with this connection, investigators obtained a search warrant for Hartman's home and property. What they found there confirmed their worst fears. In Hartman's basement, they discovered items belonging to all 3 missing women: Charity's watch, Margaret's hospital ID badge, and Jennifer's distinctive necklace. More disturbing still, forensic evidence suggested the women had been held in the basement at different times. A more extensive search of the property, including a wooded area behind the house, led to the discovery of human remains. DNA testing would later confirm they belonged to Charity Wilson and Margaret Hoffman. Jennifer Cruz's remains were eventually found in a remote location about an hour outside of Portland, buried in a shallow grave. The medical examiner determined that all 3 women had been strangled to death. Jessie Hartman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. When confronted with the evidence, he reportedly showed no emotion, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming physical evidence connecting him to the crimes. Investigators believe Hartman may be responsible for other unsolved disappearances in the region and have reopened several cold cases. The investigation continues as authorities work to determine the full extent of his crimes. During the investigation, a disturbing pattern emerged. Hartman's history of violence against women dated back to his early adulthood. He had been the subject of multiple restraining orders filed by former girlfriends and had served time for assault. How many warning signs were missed over the years? Could earlier intervention have prevented these 3 murders? For the families of Charity, Margaret, and Jennifer, the arrest brought mixed emotions. There was relief that the person responsible had been caught, but also renewed grief as they confronted the reality of what had happened to their loved ones. Jennifer's mother told reporters, "We always held out hope that she might come home. Now we have to accept that she's gone forever." The case also raised questions about the effectiveness of the system in addressing patterns of violence. Despite his history, Hartman had repeatedly avoided serious consequences for his behavior, allowing his violence to escalate over time. As the case proceeds through the courts, the community continues to grapple with the knowledge that a predator lived among them for years, hiding in plain sight. What responsibility do we have to recognize and report concerning behavior? How can communities better protect vulnerable individuals? As we come to the end of our journey through these 7 disturbing true crime cases, I want to thank you for listening. Each of these stories reminds us of the darkness that can exist in human nature, but also of the resilience of those left behind and the dedication of those who seek justice. These cases, while disturbing, serve as important reminders to remain vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to look out for one another. They teach us that patterns of behavior matter, that warning signs should never be ignored, and that justice, even when delayed, remains an essential part of healing. I hope that as you drift off to sleep tonight, comforted by the sound of rain, you'll carry with you not just the memory of these disturbing tales, but also an appreciation for the safety and peace that most of us are fortunate enough to enjoy. If you found value in tonight's stories, please consider subscribing to this channel for more true crime content. Leave a comment with your thoughts on these cases. Which one affected you the most? Do you have theories about the unsolved Dardine family murders? And if you know someone who might appreciate these stories, please share this video with them. Together, we can keep the memories of these victims alive and perhaps, in some small way, contribute to a world where such crimes become increasingly rare. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and stay safe.